Anyone else have a partner's childhood friend cross every line? I sat in my car for 20 minutes after it happened, staring at my hands on the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just experienced. My husband sat beside me in complete silence, and for the first time in our marriage, I wondered if I really knew the man I'd fallen in love with. Let me start from the beginning because this story isn't really about one afternoon, it's about years of small cuts that I'd been telling myself didn't hurt, until one day they nearly bled me dry. When I married my husband 3 years ago, I thought I'd finally found my person. After my previous relationship ended with my ex cheating on me with his best friend, a betrayal that shattered my ability to trust for years, finding someone kind, patient, hilarious, and completely loyal felt like winning the lottery. He was everything I'd dreamed of, everything I thought I'd never have. He'd never given me a single reason to question his faithfulness or his commitment to our marriage. Until Claire entered the picture. Or rather, until I finally admitted that Claire had always been in the picture, hovering at the edges of our happiness like a shadow I'd been pretending not to see. Claire was his childhood best friend, and from the moment we met, something felt off. Not in an obvious way, she was never outright rude or hostile. Instead, she perfected the art of the subtle slight, the kind of behavior that made me question my own perceptions. Was I being too sensitive? Was I imagining the way she talked around me instead of to me? Was I crazy for noticing that she somehow managed to make me feel invisible in every room we shared? I tried everything to connect with her. I smiled through awkward conversations. I invited her to our birthdays, barbecues, and even our engagement dinner. She declined them all. When our wedding day arrived, she was notably absent. Yet somehow, she always found reasons to invite my husband over to her place, usually timing these invitations perfectly with her latest breakup when she needed someone to talk to. My husband, to his credit, was never secretive about these visits. He'd mention them casually, never acting like he had anything to hide. When I expressed my discomfort, he'd dismiss my concerns with gentle reassurance. "You're overthinking it," he'd say. "Claire's just a little odd socially. She doesn't mean anything by it." Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe she was just awkward. Maybe I was letting my past trauma with cheating make me paranoid about a completely innocent friendship. I convinced myself to be the understanding wife, the secure woman who didn't feel threatened by her husband's female friends. I buried my instincts and tried to be better than my doubts. Then, a few weeks ago, everything changed with a single text message. Claire reached out to me directly for the first time in years, asking if I'd model for her photography project. I stared at my phone in shock. After years of cold shoulders and deliberate exclusion, she was asking for my help? Part of me wanted to decline immediately, but another part, the part that still hoped for peace, saw this as a potential olive branch. Maybe she was finally ready to try. Maybe this was her way of extending friendship. God, I was naive. When I agreed, my husband offered to come along, saying he hadn't seen Claire in a while and thought it would be fun to catch up afterward. I was actually pleased by this suggestion. If they were going to maintain their friendship, I wanted to be part of it, not excluded from it. The photography session was scheduled at Claire's family home, which made sense once I saw it. Her family had money, serious money. They'd converted part of their house into a professional photography studio, complete with professional lighting and backdrops. Claire was a photography major, and this shoot was for her final project. I'd done some hobby modeling over the years, nothing professional, but enough to help out a friend's academic work. What I wasn't prepared for was walking into what felt like a theatrical performance designed specifically to humiliate me. From the moment we stepped through the door, Claire's mother and sister began referring to my husband as our son-in-law. I laughed awkwardly, certain I'd misheard. But the comments kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. During the shoot, while I posed and Claire clicked away with her camera, her family provided a running commentary of passive-aggressive observations. "The one that got away," her sister said with a knowing smile. "Some bonds never fade," her mother added, gazing at my husband with unmistakable fondness. Then came the comment that nearly broke me: "We always thought Claire would end up with him. But life has its detours, I guess." And finally, "Claire always imagined walking down the aisle with him." It's sweet of her to fill in, though. I stood there in that makeshift studio, wearing someone else's clothes, posing for someone else's camera, while an entire family discussed my husband as if he belonged to them and I was just a temporary inconvenience. The worst part wasn't even what they were saying, it was what they weren't saying. Claire never once told them to stop. She never laughed awkwardly or tried to redirect the conversation. She just kept taking pictures, smiling serenely, as if the systematic demolition of my dignity was exactly what she'd hoped to capture on film. My husband was visibly uncomfortable. I watched him fidget, clear his throat, try to change the subject. He moved closer to me during the shoot, clearly sensing the hostility in the room. But he didn't speak up. He didn't tell them to stop. He didn't pull the plug on the whole humiliating spectacle and walk out with me. I endured an hour of this treatment. An hour of smiling while being torn apart. An hour of posing while feeling like a specimen in someone else's social experiment. When it was finally over, I gathered my things with as much dignity as I could manage and walked to the car in silence. The drive home was excruciating. My husband was quiet for most of the trip, then finally said, "Sorry about all that. That was weird, right?" Weird. That's what he called it. Not cruel, not unacceptable, not grounds for ending a friendship on the spot. Weird. I didn't know how to respond. Because yes, it was weird. But it was also calculated, deliberate, and deeply disrespectful. And the fact that he'd witnessed every moment of it, felt uncomfortable enough to apologize afterward, but hadn't been moved to defend me in the moment left me feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in our marriage. I spent the next few days in a strange emotional limbo. Part of me wanted to confront my husband immediately, to demand explanations and ultimatums. But another part of me worried I was overreacting. Maybe this was just how Claire's family was. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I needed to develop thicker skin. Then my sister-in-law Madeline sent me a video that changed everything. Madeline was part of the wider social circle that included Claire, though they weren't close friends. She'd seen something on Claire's social media that made her blood boil, and she immediately forwarded it to me with a simple, "WTF." It was a screen recording from Claire's close friend's story on Instagram. The video showed me posing during the photography session, but what made my stomach drop wasn't seeing myself on camera, it was hearing the audio. Claire had posted this video with the sound of her sister saying, "Claire should have been the one to marry him," playing clearly in the background. She had posted evidence of my humiliation for her close friends to see. She had turned my degradation into content for social media. The photography session hadn't been an olive branch or even just a cruel afternoon, it had been performance art, with me as the unwitting subject and her social media followers as the intended audience. When my husband came home from work that evening, I was waiting for him with the video queued up on my phone. I didn't say anything, just handed him the phone and watched his face as he processed what he was seeing. He watched it once, then again, and I saw his expression change from confusion to anger to something that looked like shame. That's when I finally said everything I'd been holding back for years. I told him about every snide comment, every cold shoulder, every time Claire had made me feel small and unwelcome in his life. I explained how I'd tried to be civil, how I'd never asked him to choose between us, how I'd bent over backward to be the understanding wife who didn't make demands about his friendships. But I was done. "If this doesn't bother you enough to act, we've got a bigger problem," I told him. "I'm not going to be in a marriage where I have to beg to be defended. I need a partner who stands up for me. And if that's not you, then I need to rethink this." He didn't argue or get defensive. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize what had happened. He just listened, and I could see the weight of his silence at that photography session settling on his shoulders like a burden he couldn't shake. Then I showed him something else, a post I'd written online, seeking advice from strangers because I felt so isolated and confused by my own experience. I showed him hundreds of comments from people who'd read my story and immediately recognized what I'd been too close to see clearly, that I'd been emotionally abused, systematically undermined, and completely disrespected, and that my husband's failure to protect me was almost as damaging as Claire's behavior itself. He read every comment. Some of them brought tears to his eyes. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "I feel like the worst husband in the world. I let this happen right in front of me. I'm so sorry. What do you need from me now?" "This isn't just about her anymore," I told him. "It's about whether you're willing to protect this marriage. I'm not going to feel like I'm second place in my own relationship. It's either me or her." That evening, we called Claire together. She answered cheerfully, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just humiliated me on social media for her friends' entertainment. When we brought up the video, she immediately became defensive. "Oh, come on, it was just a joke. Are you really mad over that?" That's when my husband finally became the partner I'd needed him to be all along. "This isn't just about the video," he said, his voice steady and firm. "It's about the constant disrespect toward my wife. I didn't say anything before because I didn't want to lose your friendship, and I convinced myself you didn't mean it. But what happened at that shoot? That was disgusting. My wife came to support you and your family treated her like a joke. I didn't speak up then and I'm ashamed of that. But that ends now. If you can't respect my wife, you don't respect me." Claire's response revealed everything about who she really was. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Wow, you're really cutting me off over that girl?" I was ready to explode, but my husband kept his composure. "If choosing between you and my wife ever felt like a hard decision, I wouldn't deserve her. We're not kids anymore. You need to grow up. I don't want to be your friend anymore. I have nothing else to say." We blocked Claire and her entire family that night. Since then, my husband has been different, more attentive, more protective, more aware of how his actions affect me. He's not trying to fix what happened or make excuses for his past behavior. He's just showing up, listening, and proving through his actions that he finally understands what I've been dealing with all these years. We still have healing to do. Trust, once shaken, doesn't rebuild overnight. But for the first time since that horrible photography session, I know where my husband stands. I know he sees me, values me, and will fight for our marriage when it matters. The photography session wasn't an olive branch, it was a final power play, a chance to humiliate me in front of my husband and document it for posterity. She wanted to prove that she would always have a piece of him that I could never touch, and she wanted me to know it. But in trying to destroy my marriage, she actually saved it. She forced a conversation that was years overdue. She revealed her true character so clearly that even my conflict-avoidant husband couldn't ignore it anymore. And she gave me the clarity I needed to stop accepting treatment that I never should have tolerated in the first place. I grew up in an emotionally abusive household, where passive-aggressive comments and subtle cruelty were just background noise. I'd learned to minimize harm, to tell myself that things weren't as bad as they seemed, to accept treatment that no one should have to accept. Claire's behavior felt familiar enough that I normalized it, but it took hundreds of strangers on the internet telling me that what happened to me was completely unacceptable for me to finally see it clearly. The photography session was supposed to be Claire's final project. Instead, it became the final chapter of her presence in our lives, and the first chapter of a marriage where I finally feel seen, valued, and protected. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing that could have happened. I'm grateful for that clarity, even if it came at such a painful price. Story 2. How do you handle a childhood friend who thinks your spouse is destined for them? I woke up that Sunday morning to the sound of my husband's phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. As a doctor, he was used to getting calls and messages at all hours, so I didn't think much of it until I heard him gasp. That small sound, barely audible, sent ice through my veins. I'd never heard him make that noise before. "What is it?" I asked, immediately alert despite the early hour. He sat up in bed, staring at his phone with an expression I'd never seen on his face, a mixture of shock, disgust, and something that looked almost like fear. "You need to see this," he said quietly, handing me the phone. What I read changed everything. A series of text messages from someone I'd considered a sweet family friend, messages that were so inappropriate and delusional that I had to read them twice to believe they were real. She had declared her love for my husband, claimed that God had brought them together through her father's illness, and insisted that she'd always known they'd end up together. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but not in the way you might expect. This wasn't about jealousy or fear that my husband would reciprocate her feelings. Our marriage was solid, built on trust and mutual respect that had weathered far worse storms than this. No, what devastated me was the realization that someone I'd welcomed into our lives, someone I'd felt genuine compassion for during her family's medical crisis, had been harboring romantic fantasies about my husband while accepting his professional help and emotional support. Let me back up and explain how we got here, because this story isn't really about one woman's inappropriate confession. It's about the complex web of family loyalty, professional obligation, and personal boundaries that can entangle even the strongest relationships. My husband had grown up with this woman, let's call her Sarah. Their families had been intertwined since childhood, practically raising the kids together in that tight-knit Southern community way that creates bonds spanning generations. When we met and married, Sarah was already married with 2 children, living several states away from us in the South while we'd built our life in the Northeast. She'd always seemed sweet during our occasional interactions, and I'd never had any reason to think of her as anything other than a distant but friendly family connection. When Sarah's father was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer with a low recovery rate, the dynamics shifted dramatically. The medical care available in their rural Southern community was adequate but limited, and everyone knew that the specialized treatment centers in our area offered significantly better options. As a doctor, my husband naturally stepped in to help navigate the complex world of oncology referrals, treatment protocols, and second opinions. I was proud of him for this. One of the things I love most about my husband is his genuine desire to help people, his willingness to use his expertise and connections to make a difference in the lives of people he cares about. When friends and family reach out for medical advice or reassurance, he never hesitates to offer whatever guidance he can. It's one of his most admirable qualities, and frankly, it makes me incredibly proud to be married to someone that people trust and respect so deeply. What started as occasional consultations gradually became more frequent and more intense. Sarah would call at all hours, seeking not just medical information but emotional support as she watched her father decline. She'd text my husband detailed updates about her father's condition, her fears about the prognosis, her struggles with the medical bureaucracy. She'd ask for recommendations for specialists, help interpreting test results, guidance on treatment options. My husband handled all of this with his characteristic professionalism and compassion. When he shifted into what I call his medical mindset, he became completely focused on the clinical aspects of a case. Personal relationships took a backseat to patient care, and he approached Sarah's father's situation with the same dedication he'd bring to any patient. I wasn't jealous of the time and attention he devoted to this case because I understood that this was who he was, a healer who couldn't turn away from someone who needed help. But Sarah's neediness was escalating beyond normal bounds. The calls became longer and more frequent. The texts began arriving at all hours of the day and night. What had started as medical consultations gradually morphed into lengthy emotional support sessions where Sarah would pour out her fears, her grief, her overwhelming sense of helplessness as she watched her father suffer. I tried to be understanding. Cancer is devastating not just for patients but for their families, and I knew from my own experience how isolating and terrifying a cancer diagnosis could be. I'd battled cancer myself in my early 20s, an ordeal that had cost me my fertility and nearly cost me everything else. I understood the desperate need to reach out to anyone who might offer hope, guidance, or simply a compassionate ear. So I didn't complain when my husband spent hours on the phone with Sarah. I didn't object when he rearranged his schedule to help coordinate her father's care. I didn't express frustration when our quiet evenings together were interrupted by her urgent calls. I told myself that this was temporary, that once her father's situation stabilized or resolved, things would return to normal. I never imagined that Sarah was interpreting my husband's professional compassion as something entirely different. The text messages that arrived that Sunday morning revealed a fantasy world I never could have anticipated. In Sarah's mind, my husband's medical expertise and emotional support had become evidence of romantic destiny. His willingness to help during her family's crisis had somehow transformed, in her perception, into proof that God intended them to be together. His professional availability had been reinterpreted as personal devotion. "I've always known we'd end up together," she'd written. "God brought us together through this trial for a reason." The messages went on to detail her romantic feelings, her belief that their childhood friendship had been building toward this moment, her conviction that my husband felt the same way but was somehow constrained by his current circumstances. She painted a picture of their future together, a life where they'd support each other through all of life's challenges, where their families would finally be united as she'd always dreamed. It was delusional, manipulative, and deeply disturbing. But what made it even worse was her final plea: "Please don't tell your wife about this. I know she wouldn't understand." That last line revealed everything about who Sarah really was. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew she was crossing every possible line of appropriate behavior. She knew she was betraying not just my marriage but her own professed values and friendships. And she was asking my husband to become complicit in that betrayal by keeping secrets from me. She had fundamentally misunderstood both my husband and our marriage. My husband's response was immediate and uncompromising. He texted her back that morning, making it clear that her declarations were highly inappropriate, that she needed to seek professional therapeutic help, and that he could no longer provide medical assistance to her family. When she responded claiming she'd been drinking and was overly emotional, he didn't accept the excuse. When she begged him again not to tell me, he told her we don't keep secrets from each other. Then he blocked her number entirely. I didn't ask him to cut all ties. That decision came entirely from him, motivated by his respect for our marriage and his understanding of professional boundaries. "She has other doctors and family members to lean on," he told me. "I can't maintain any kind of relationship with someone who would disrespect you and our marriage like that." But even as I felt grateful for his decisive response, I found myself wrestling with unexpected guilt. What if my husband's withdrawal from the case negatively impacted her father's medical care? What if there was some consultation or referral that only my husband could provide, something that might make the difference in her father's treatment outcomes? I knew rationally that one doctor's involvement rarely makes or breaks a case, especially when that doctor was providing informal consultation rather than direct care. But the guilt gnawed at me nonetheless. I wondered if there might have been a middle path, some way for my husband to maintain minimal contact with Sarah's mother for medical purposes while cutting off all direct communication with Sarah herself. Maybe he could have continued to provide guidance through other family members, maintaining his commitment to helping her father without enabling Sarah's inappropriate behavior. These thoughts made me feel selfish and petty. Here was a family dealing with terminal cancer, and I was worried about protecting my marriage from a woman whose romantic fantasies posed no real threat to our relationship. Was I being unreasonable? Was I prioritizing my own comfort over a dying man's access to better medical care? The situation became even more complicated when my mother-in-law got involved. Within days of my husband cutting contact with Sarah, his mother called in a fury. According to her, I was somehow to blame for this entire situation. The details of what Sarah had told her remained unclear, but the message was crystal clear: I was the villain in this story, the controlling wife who had manipulated her son into abandoning longtime family friends in their hour of greatest need. This accusation hit me like a slap across the face, partly because it was so unfair and partly because it wasn't entirely surprising. My mother-in-law and I had never gotten along. I wasn't the Christian housewife she'd envisioned for her only child, and she'd made her disapproval clear from the beginning of our relationship. She'd actually begged my husband not to marry me, claiming our civil ceremony wasn't a real wedding because it hadn't taken place in a church. We'd gone no contact with her for a period before our wedding, and even now maintained only minimal contact because my husband refused to tolerate her behavior. But this latest attack felt particularly cruel because it weaponized my deepest insecurities. My cancer experience in my early 20s hadn't just cost me my fertility, it had also cost me a previous relationship. My boyfriend at the time had cheated on me with a mutual friend while I was undergoing treatment, later claiming he'd been overwhelmed by my illness and that I was somehow responsible for driving him into another woman's arms. The betrayal and abandonment I'd felt during that period had left scars that never fully healed. Now, facing accusations that I was being controlling and manipulative, those old wounds reopened. Was I repeating patterns from my past? Was I being unreasonable in my expectations? Was my trauma making me overreact to a situation that could have been handled differently? My husband, fortunately, saw the situation with perfect clarity. When his mother called demanding a private conversation about family matters, he put her on speakerphone and made it clear that I was his family now. When she launched into accusations about my abusive and controlling behavior, citing our previous period of no contact as evidence of my manipulation, he defended me with a forcefulness that surprised even me. I had to leave the room during that conversation because my anxiety was overwhelming. The combination of Sarah's betrayal, my mother-in-law's accusations, and my own guilt about potentially affecting a cancer patient's care had triggered something close to a panic attack. But when my husband found me in our bedroom a few minutes later, he was calm and resolute. I told her how disgusted I was with her behavior, he said, sitting beside me on the bed. I explained that she hadn't learned her lesson about interfering in our marriage, and that I'd be taking an indefinite break from contact with her. I also told her not to contact you directly. I know you've already got her silenced, but I wanted to make it explicit. Then he shared a detail that put the entire situation into horrifying perspective. His mother had been spending significant time with Sarah, helping care for her children while Sarah and her mother dealt with the medical crisis. The two women had apparently grown close during this period, bonding over their shared belief that my husband belonged with Sarah rather than with me. The conspiracy was deeper than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about one woman's inappropriate feelings, it was about a coordinated effort to undermine my marriage, orchestrated by people who had never accepted my place in my husband's life. In the days that followed, my mother-in-law's desperation became increasingly apparent. She tried calling my husband from his father's phone, hoping to circumvent the boundaries he'd established. When that failed, my father-in-law called to apologize, explaining that his wife had used his phone without permission and that he supported our decision to create distance from her toxic behavior. She's been spinning quite a story about what happened, my father-in-law told my husband. But now that I know the truth, I understand why you need to step away from her. The full picture that emerged was devastating. My mother-in-law had apparently been encouraging Sarah's romantic fantasies for months, possibly years. As my husband's only child, born after years of infertility struggles, he'd been the center of his mother's world since birth. She'd tried to control every aspect of his life, his choice of college, his decision to move away from home, his career path, and most importantly, his choice of wife. In her mind, Sarah represented everything I wasn't. Sarah was from their hometown, shared their background, attended their church, and most crucially, could potentially give her the grandchildren I couldn't provide. My hysterectomy, necessitated by my cancer treatment, had been the final nail in my coffin as far as my mother-in-law was concerned. She'd never forgiven me for being unable to carry on the family line, and she'd apparently been working behind the scenes to replace me with someone who could fulfill her vision of her son's perfect life. The betrayal was multi-layered and years in the making. While I'd been trying to be supportive of my husband's desire to help a family friend through a medical crisis, that family friend had been nurturing romantic fantasies about him, encouraged by his own mother who saw this as an opportunity to finally get the daughter-in-law she'd always wanted. But here's what they all failed to understand. My husband had never been available for their machinations. His loyalty to our marriage was absolute, his respect for professional boundaries was non-negotiable, and his ability to see through manipulation was far sharper than they'd anticipated. The moment Sarah crossed the line from friend seeking medical advice to woman declaring romantic intent, he shut it down completely. When his mother tried to blame me for his decisions, he cut her off without hesitation. "I chose you," he told me that night as we processed everything that had happened. "I chose you when I proposed, I chose you when I married you, and I'm choosing you now." These people don't get to make decisions about our life together. The guilt I'd been carrying about potentially affecting her father's medical care gradually dissolved as I realized the true nature of what we'd been dealing with. This had never been just about providing medical consultation to a family friend. It had been about emotional manipulation, boundary violations, and a coordinated effort to destabilize our marriage. My husband's decision to withdraw completely hadn't been an overreaction. It had been the only appropriate response to a situation that had become completely untenable. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on the broader lessons of this experience. My people-pleasing tendencies, rooted in trauma from my cancer experience, had made me vulnerable to manipulation. I'd been so focused on being understanding and supportive that I'd ignored my own instincts about Sarah's increasingly inappropriate behavior. My therapist and I spent several sessions working through these patterns, helping me recognize that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary for maintaining healthy relationships. I also gained a deeper appreciation for my husband's character. In a world where so many people struggle to prioritize their marriages over other relationships, he'd never hesitated to choose us. When faced with pressure from lifelong family friends and his own mother, he'd stood firm in his commitment to our partnership. When professional obligations conflicted with personal boundaries, he'd made the difficult but correct choice to step away. The situation with my mother-in-law remained unresolved, but that was her choice. She could have acknowledged her role in encouraging inappropriate behavior, apologized for her accusations against me, and worked to rebuild trust with her son. Instead, she doubled down on her position, apparently believing that her disapproval of me justified any means necessary to remove me from the picture. My husband had made it clear that reconciliation was possible, but only if she could respect our marriage and treat me with basic decency. So far, she'd shown no interest in meeting those minimal requirements. As for Sarah, we heard through mutual acquaintances that her father had passed away several months later. Despite everything that had happened, I felt genuine sadness about his death. Cancer is a brutal disease, and no family should have to watch someone they love suffer through it. I hoped that Sarah had found the professional therapeutic support my husband had recommended, and that she'd been able to focus on her father's final months without the distraction of her romantic fantasies. But I also knew that my husband's withdrawal from the case hadn't affected the quality of her father's care. Other doctors had provided the necessary consultations and referrals. Her father had received excellent medical attention from qualified professionals who were actually responsible for his case, rather than from a family friend providing informal advice from across the country. In the end, Sarah's inappropriate confession had done us a favor. It had forced a reckoning that was probably years overdue, clearing out the toxic relationships that had been undermining our happiness while strengthening the bond between us. Sometimes the worst betrayals become the best opportunities for growth, and sometimes the people who try to destroy your marriage end up showing you exactly how strong it really is.